everyone, welcome back to Naomi's Bookshelf. Today we're going to talk about the 10 books that you could read for July's round of Buzzwordathon. So in July, we have the word last for our buzzword this time, and of course, for Buzzwordathon being the 1st to the 7th, I was like, this will be great, until I looked at the books I have read to recommend, and not many of them have the word last in the title. So I did not think about this when I first started my project and promised you all a video at the beginning or right before the beginning of the month for a recommendation. Now I decided to buckle down and read enough books to recommend to you a variety. And I've done that. I have read enough to supplement the books I hadn't read, and I feel like we have a good selection here that I would genuinely recommend, not only because I just read them, but because they're all good books in my opinion. So let's get into the stack. So let's start with a romance, and this would be The Last Carolina Sister. This is by Michelle Major. I know this is book 3 in a series, and I did my best to find the first books in series, but honestly, it's not always possible. And especially when the word is last, I'll be honest, that was really hard. However, this one is really good, and as a romance book series, I don't think they always have to be read in order. This one follows Meredith as she owns a farm and takes care of many rescue animals, and Ryan as he is recovering from an injury that he suffered in an ER, and he is recovering essentially, and he ends up helping her at her farm, and they develop a relationship and a romance, and it is so sweet and wonderful, but it handles a lot of tough topics. I thought it was really well handled, and it was a little on the sexy side, but not too much, and I felt like it had a good balance of really heavy content at the same time as relationships and light, funny moments. I really, really enjoyed this whole book, aside from the parts I skipped because I don't read smutty scenes, but I do think this is a really great one if you want to read a romance novel for that week. I think it's a brilliant one to pick up, and I've already gone and picked up book 1 from my library because I think I want to read the other books in the series. It does follow 3 sisters who are all half sisters because their father slept around. So none of them have the same mother, and that's kind of how they are all tied together. It's a very interesting relationship dynamic, and I think it works really well. I also loved how Meredith is not soft-spoken. She does not have people skills, and yet it is a really well-developed story about her developing those, but at the same time, just being herself. I think it's a really great one. Another one I would recommend is a poetry collection. This is one that I discovered from my library and thought, why not? It's called You Took the Last Bus Home. This is by Brian Bilston, or Bilston. This is British, so you might not get all the humor. I happen to watch a lot of British TV shows and a lot of British game shows, so I definitely picked up what he was saying. However, you might miss it if you don't watch a lot of those kind of things like I do. However, this is really brilliant, and I feel like if you don't read the author's note at the beginning, you might be confused. It is very intentional, the kind of poetry he does, and he made a comment at the beginning where it's like, these poems are hard to make. Some of them were really difficult, and they were the ones that didn't rhyme or the ones that were really obscure, but it was so interesting, and I genuinely laughed out loud. I thought these were so intentionally funny and so insightful into our world, and most poetry collections kind of go over my head, and this one did not. I really thoroughly flew through this, thoroughly loved it, and I gave it 5 stars, and this is brilliant. I think you should totally pick this one up, and I'm not just saying this because I read it for a video. Next up, we have our Agatha Christie, which is Sleeping Murder, Miss Marple's last case. So I could have given you Poirot's last case, but I haven't read it yet. This one is very interesting because Agatha Christie wrote it as she thought she was going to die during the Blitz happenings in London. So she wrote it around the 45, like around 45 or around the 40s. And Miss Marple was not finished being written at that point because obviously Agatha Christie lived to, I think, the 70s. So she wrote this one earlier on, and she continued writing a Miss Marple book. So this one's very well done. It's not reused plot lines because this is when she was still actively, I don't want to say actively writing, because she was actively writing, but this is when she was not reusing things, and you can tell that she was in her prime of writing. It's brilliantly plotted. It's about this woman who moves into a new home, and as she's moved into this new home, she kind of discovers that certain things in the house aren't as they should be, at least to her thinking. Like, there should be a door behind this wallpaper, and then sure enough, there's the door behind that wallpaper. Or certain places of the house aren't correct, and she thinks that maybe she lived there before, and Miss Marple kind of comes in and helps her discover that there was a murder in the past, and she might have actually been a witness to it. And then obviously events come into play, and it's like a murder that happened later on, and Gwenda has to figure it out with the help of Miss Marple. It is really good, and because it was written so much earlier in the canon of when Miss Marple was written as a whole, but yet it was meant to be the last Miss Marple story, I think you can read it at any point and not have to be the last Miss Marple case, as Poirot last case has to be the last one. Although I think that was also written during the same time, because Agatha Christie did not want her audience to be left without their last stories. I think this one can be read at any time. The next one is The Last Time I Lied by Riley Sagar. This one is about a woman named Emma who came back from an art scene in New York to go back to a camp that she went to as a child, or, well, teenager. And when she was there, she had an interesting experience with some of her fellow campers. And it was quite an interesting book to read, because it's told like in flashbacks and like with times at the camp, and then also what happened currently with her story. It is her being a camp counselor now and trying to rediscover what happened, because she's kind of blocked out what events. It is so interesting, and I think it is worth a read if you're wanting a fast-paced action one. I really enjoyed this one, especially since it has a lot of games in it, a lot of camp ideas, and at the same time, it's always interesting, and it's a really short one compared to some mystery thrillers can be like a little on the dense side, like in terms of page count, and this one is not. The next one I have is The Last Sin Eater by Francesca Rivers. This one is a historical fiction, essentially, but it is a Christian storyline about these clans of Irish immigrants, I think they're Irish, who have come across to the States and who have this idea that someone has to be a sin eater and they have to live alone, and they take on all the sins of the community and no one can be in contact with them. And it's about essentially a cult kind of idea. This is definitely a Christian fiction about that, and it is a very interesting take, and I think it's actually set in historical events, and that's an interesting idea to me. It's been a while since I've read it, but I do want to reread it eventually. It's such an interesting idea about how someone has to take on that burden and then leave, and no one can be in contact with them. However, that person has to carry the weight of everyone's sins in the community on them, or everyone's burdens. So it's an interesting idea, and it has the word last in the title. The last physical book I have is The Last Black Unicorn by Tiffany Haddish. I have never watched a Tiffany Haddish movie. I don't think her sense of humor really aligns with me, I've got to say. However, when I was reading this book, I was like, will I recommend it? Yes, I will. Because I think this story is so impactful. I think this book is not for the faint of heart, because there is a lot of language in this. However, I was physically reading it and I could not put it down because of just her life story is so crazy. Like being in the foster system, her mom being abusive, having her awful boyfriends, her awful husband, being a comedian and trying to come up in a comedian man-filled world. It was so interesting, and I was so consistently engaged with this book. I think it's something that you should totally pick up if you're interested at all in that world, at all in that kind of culture, but also just because of how sometimes books like this push you outside your comfort zone, and having to do 10 books like this pushed me outside of my comfort zone and picking up this one, and I'm really glad I read it. I'm really, really glad I read it. I tried to watch one of her comedy shows, and it just wasn't for me. I think it's just not my sense of humor, but that's okay. I'm really glad I finished this book, and I highly rated it 4 stars. Really glad I did, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's really interested in her as a person, but also anyone who's interested in just someone who, you know, struggled through these awful situations and decided that I'm going to push through and not take crap from anyone, because that's what she did. Like, genuinely, that's what she did. And I was quite pleased with how the story turned out. And you know what? Her story's not over, because she's still busy, she's still working, and I am happy to say that I would read another book by her, to be honest. I would. A middle grade I would recommend is The Last Rabbit by Shelley Moore Thomas. This one was really interesting. This one is a myth-based one about Ireland, and it is a middle grade fantasy and time travel, and it was good. I listened to it and then physically read it, and I loved it. It is about this little rabbit named Albie who was a girl, and then she cast a spell and turned all of her and her sisters into rabbits. And the whole premise is that she and her sisters have to leave the island, and they can only not be rabbits anymore unless they found their destiny. And this boy has to take them off of the island that they are on with the magician, but the island is sinking. And so Albie has to leave the island eventually, but she can only go willingly. And the boy can't take her without her consent. And she has to kind of decide what she wants to do, if she wants to leave, and then if she does leave, what's her destiny. It was so wonderful. I loved the time travel elements, which I normally don't love in books, but I really enjoyed it in this one. And then I loved the family element. I loved how she's a little talking rabbit, and how she just is so stubborn and strong-willed, and how the sisters all just bind together and they just love each other so much. It's also set right after World War II, and their parents died in the war, and it was just so much fun. So The Last Rabbit, totally recommend for a middle grade if you are at all interested. I am not one for talking animals in books typically. I'm trying to get more used to it because I think there's so many out there that I would love, and this is one of them. The next one is Last Will and Testament by Molly McRae. This one is about Kath, who is the recent inheritor of her grandmother's wool shop, and she is really, unfortunately, going through a hard time as her grandmother just passed away, and she is feeling all alone in the world. She is really struggling because of all these situations, and she's going to this small town. It is about a paranormal situation, as suddenly she can talk to ghosts, or at least one ghost. And it is not my kind of thing normally. However, really enjoyed this. The ghost was fun, and Kath as a character was like, this is not normal. I don't understand why I can talk to this ghost, and why this ghost can talk to me, and why I'm the only one who can see this ghost. And she's panicking the whole time, but then it's really fun. I also really loved the mystery, and my main concern with cozy mysteries can be the lack of focus on the mystery. I don't mind when a cozy mystery is about the town and things like that and the people around. However, I want it to be about the mystery too. And this one was about the mystery, and it's about the town, but mostly it focused on the mystery and how that related to the town. So I was really impressed, and I am really excited to read book 2, which is not normal for me about paranormal stuff. So highly recommend Last Will and Testament. If you're wanting a cozy mystery or anything like that, it was really fun, and I thought it was really brilliant. I'm going to read the next title as it's a bit of a long one. It says Rebel Women of the West Coast, Their Triumphs, Tragedies, and Lasting Legacies by Rich Moll. So this one is a pretty short nonfiction about women of the West Coast, obviously, and it was about the first doctor, the first rebel writer, the first, I think, school teacher here, well, not here particularly, but of the West Coast. So it covered like Canada and the States on the West Coast. It also had a scientist, the first politician, these kind of women who were like first of their fields, who broke the mold. And it was really interesting in that regard. I just wish it had been longer. So I would recommend it. It was 3 stars for me, but I think it was a solid book for that and a quick read. So I think it was a solid one to read for this. And as I said, I just wish it was a bit longer or a bit more in depth about certain women, as I was interested to know more. However, when it's about, I'd say 20 pages long about each woman, it's just not enough for me, or 15 pages, it's just too short. So that was my only complaint. However, I do think it's a really solid book about history and really interesting stuff. So the next one and the last one is The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch. This one is a lecture that a man gave. His name is Randy Pausch, obviously, as I said, and he found out, I believe, that he had cancer. And so as a lecturer, he gave this last and final lecture as essentially life lessons that he would give to his children as he was dying, and he wanted to make this really memorable and really important. And it was impactful, and it was sad, and it was tear-jerking, and it was so emotional, but really, really important, and so good. I think it's best if you listen to it, honestly. It's really, really good as an audiobook, but man, it like rips at your heart. And it was just things like, you know, how you treat people, and, you know, things that he specially learned, and things about his life. And it was just things that, you know, he'd tell his kids because he didn't have much time. And I think it was just like his last hurrah as a teacher. And yeah, I've been in that place as a student before, not as the last lecture, but, you know, and it feels difficult, but at the same time, it's so personal. And I felt like this book was that way at the same time. So really recommend this one, especially if you've read When Breath Becomes Air and you liked that one. This is that kind of thing. So yeah, The Last Lecture is something I highly recommend. All right, now we're gonna do what I want to read for Buzzwordathon. I'm only picking one, and I almost read it for my recommendations, but then I was like, actually, I want to read this for me. And that would be The Last High by Daniel Kalla. Now, this one is a medical thriller set in Vancouver, so I love BC books. And this one, to my understanding, is about ER that suddenly has a couple patients come in who have like drugs overdose. However, they start dying, and it's because they've been poisoned with those drugs, and suddenly more come in, and it's like the drugs were bad, and either it's intentional or it's not, and the police have to get involved, and it's a medical thriller. I'm really interested. It sounds really good, and I cannot wait to read about this one. So I am really excited to read this one. I decided to save it for myself and not be spoiled and share it with you all. So you'll have to check it out if I enjoyed it or not in my mid-month wrap-up. So that'll be the end of this month's Buzzwordathon recommendations. Please leave anything down below that you would recommend for this month's Buzzwordathon. Also, if you have any recommendations that I should check out for next month's Buzzwordathon, as they are time of day, whether it be like morning, dawn, sunset, night, anything like that you think I should check out for that recommendations video, you can leave a list down below in the comments. You can also like this video if you like it, and subscribe if you are new here. I will chat with you in the comments, and I'll see you next time in another video. Bye for now.